There is a prison so isolated that even seasoned inmates say it feels like the end of the world. Men who survived riots, gang wars, and decades behind bars have described this place with the same words: worse than death. Not because of constant violence or chaos, but because of silence, concrete, and time that never seems to move. This is Pelican Bay State Prison. Pelican Bay did not become notorious by accident. It was designed deliberately to break patterns of prison violence by breaking human connection itself. When it opened in 1989, California officials presented it as a necessary response to rising prison gang activity. Lawmakers promised safety, control, and order. What they built instead was a place that would become one of the most controversial prisons in modern American history. The prison sits near Crescent City, just miles from the Oregon border. Its location alone sends a message. This is a place meant to be cut off. Cold ocean air hangs over the compound year-round, and dense forests isolate it from nearby towns. For inmates transferred there from Southern California or urban centers, Pelican Bay felt like exile. Family visits were rare, expensive, and emotionally draining. Even the geography reinforced the idea that once you arrived, you were meant to disappear. At the heart of Pelican Bay's reputation was the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU. Unlike the general population, the SHU was not about serving time. It was about containment. Prisoners assigned there were locked in single cells measuring roughly 8 by 10 feet. The walls were poured concrete. The doors were solid steel, punctured only by a small slot for food trays. There were no windows to the outside world. The only light came from fluorescent fixtures that hummed day and night. In these cells, inmates spent 22 to 23 hours a day alone. For the remaining hour, they were escorted, shackled at the wrists and ankles, to what officials called exercise yards. These were not fields or tracks, but concrete enclosures sometimes described by inmates as dog runs. High walls blocked the sky. Movement was limited to pacing in circles. Human contact was forbidden. What made Pelican Bay different from other maximum security prisons was not just the isolation, but its duration. Inmates were not sent to the SHU for weeks or months as punishment for specific infractions. Many were placed there indefinitely. Some remained in solitary confinement for 10, 15, even 20 years without a clear release date. The reason often came down to gang validation. California prison officials developed a system to identify members or associates of prison gangs. Tattoos, artwork, letters, books, or even the testimony of other inmates could be used as evidence. Once validated, a prisoner could be sent to the SHU without committing a new crime or violating prison rules. To get out, they were expected to debrief, to provide information about gang activity. For many inmates, this was seen as a death sentence, either inside prison or on the streets if they were ever released. Inside the SHU, time lost its meaning. There were no work assignments, no group programs, no classes. Radios were allowed, but televisions were often prohibited. Reading material was limited. Conversations with other inmates were reduced to muffled shouts through vents or plumbing pipes, risking disciplinary punishment if guards overheard. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. Former prisoners have described the mental toll as slow and relentless. At first, many tried to stay disciplined, doing push-ups, reading the same books over and over, counting steps across the cell. But over time, the isolation seeped in. Inmates reported insomnia, anxiety, panic attacks, and memory loss. Some began talking to themselves just to hear a human voice. Others banged on doors or screamed into the void, not out of rage, but desperation. Medical experts who later studied Pelican Bay found patterns that were impossible to ignore. Prisoners developed symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma. Hallucinations were common, seeing shadows move, hearing voices that were not there. Depression deepened into hopelessness. Self-harm and suicide attempts increased. Yet mentally ill inmates were still placed in the SHU, despite warnings from psychiatrists that prolonged isolation could permanently damage the brain. In 1995, Pelican Bay became the focus of a landmark federal lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez. The case exposed the inner workings of the SHU to public scrutiny for the first time. Testimony from inmates, guards, and medical professionals painted a disturbing picture. A federal judge ruled that while solitary confinement itself did not violate the Constitution, housing mentally ill prisoners under Pelican Bay's conditions amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. The decision acknowledged what inmates had been saying for years. The prison was inflicting serious harm. Despite the ruling, Pelican Bay continued to operate largely unchanged. The SHU remained full. Transfers continued. Inmates who had entered the prison in their 20s began aging in concrete boxes, watching decades of their lives disappear through a narrow metal door. For many, parole hearings came and went while they were still in isolation, unable to demonstrate rehabilitation or participate in programs that parole boards expected to see. The outside world, for a long time, barely noticed. Pelican Bay was remote, its inmates largely invisible. Media coverage was sporadic, and official statements emphasized security and safety. California's prison population was booming, and tough-on-crime policies dominated politics. The suffering inside the SHU was treated as collateral damage. That silence finally began to crack in July 2011. Without warning, inmates at Pelican Bay launched a hunger strike. Refusing food was one of the few forms of protest available to men locked alone in cells. Within days, thousands of prisoners across California joined them. Their demands were simple: an end to indefinite solitary confinement, fairer gang validation procedures, and basic human contact. For weeks, the strike dominated headlines. Families protested outside prisons. Human rights organizations issued urgent appeals. Medical staff monitored starving inmates as their weight dropped and organs weakened. Some prisoners had already spent more than 20 years in the SHU. They said they would rather risk death than continue living in isolation. The hunger strike ended, but the pressure did not. In 2013, another strike followed, larger and more organized. Lawmakers could no longer ignore what Pelican Bay represented. Testimony from former inmates reached state hearings. Words like torture and psychological destruction entered official discussions. International observers compared Pelican Bay to facilities condemned by the United Nations. By the mid-2010s, change finally came. A settlement in 2015 sharply limited the use of long-term solitary confinement in California. Indefinite SHU terms were abolished. Many inmates were released into general population after decades in isolation. Pelican Bay's SHU, once the symbol of absolute control, was dramatically reduced. But the damage had already been done. Men who walked out of the SHU described the outside world as overwhelming. Simple things, crowds, conversations, sunlight, felt unbearable. Years without human contact had altered how their minds worked. Some never fully recovered. Others said the experience changed them more than any sentence ever could. Pelican Bay still operates today, quieter and reformed on paper, but its legacy remains. For those who lived inside its concrete walls, the memory is permanent. They say it was not the violence that broke them, nor fear of other inmates. It was the slow erasure of time, identity, and connection. And that is why, when former prisoners speak about Pelican Bay, they do not talk about survival. They talk about endurance. They talk about a place where living felt like a punishment more final than death itself. When inmates describe time at Pelican Bay, they do not measure it in days or years. They measure it in routines, so repetitive they become punishment themselves. The sound of keys at dawn, the slot opening for a food tray, the brief shuffle of chains before the door closes again. In the security housing unit, life was stripped down to a mechanical cycle, repeated thousands of times until the mind began to fracture. For men sent to Pelican Bay's SHU, arrival was often sudden. Transfers happened without warning. One day an inmate would be in a regular cell, surrounded by noise, movement, and conversation. The next he would be shackled, transported hundreds of miles north, and locked into a concrete box with no explanation beyond a brief phrase: gang validation. There was no trial, no jury, and often no clear evidence presented. Tattoos that predated prison, books about Black history, Aztec symbols, or artwork found in a cell could all be used to justify isolation. Once inside the SHU, the concept of progress disappeared. Good behavior did not guarantee release. Completing programs was impossible because none existed. Parole hearings came and went with the same result: denial, often citing lack of participation in rehabilitation. Inmates were trapped in a system that demanded proof of change while denying any opportunity to demonstrate it. The psychological pressure of this contradiction was relentless. Prisoners described feeling suspended in time, as if their lives had been paused indefinitely. Birthdays passed unnoticed. Parents aged and died. Children grew into adults they barely recognized during rare, muffled phone calls. Letters became lifelines, but even those were delayed, censored, or rejected for minor technical violations. Inside the cell, silence was never complete. There was the constant hum of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of metal doors, the occasional scream from another inmate losing control. At night, some prisoners lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories just to remind themselves they still existed. Others tried to erase memory altogether, finding it too painful to recall a world they might never return to. As months turned into years, many inmates reported changes they could not stop. Concentration weakened. Reading became difficult. Simple math problems felt impossible. Some forgot faces, even their own reflections. Mirrors were absent in most cells, and when prisoners finally saw themselves years later, they were shocked by how much they had aged. Medical staff at Pelican Bay documented these effects, but treatment options were limited. Therapy sessions, when they occurred, were conducted through cell doors or thick glass, lasting minutes. Medication was often the primary response, masking symptoms without addressing the cause. Inmates suffering panic attacks or hallucinations were still confined to isolation, their conditions worsening with each passing year. Guards, too, were affected by the environment. Some officers described the SHU as emotionally draining, a place where constant control replaced human interaction. Others adopted an attitude of distance, treating inmates as objects rather than people. In such an environment, empathy became a liability. Routine enforcement replaced judgment, and suffering became normalized. The logic behind Pelican Bay's SHU rested on deterrence and control. Officials argued that extreme isolation kept gang leaders from ordering violence. But internal reports and later studies questioned this assumption. Gang activity continued across the prison system, while inmates in the SHU became increasingly desperate. Isolation did not eliminate power structures. It simply drove them underground. For prisoners labeled as gang affiliates, the only official way out of the SHU was debriefing. This process required inmates to provide detailed information about gang operations and members, often implicating others. For many, this was unthinkable. Debriefing could place their lives at risk, both inside prison and on the streets. Some inmates refused on principle. Others feared retaliation. As a result, they remained in isolation indefinitely, not because of violence, but silence. Families struggled to understand what was happening. Visits to Pelican Bay were rare due to its remote location. When visits did occur, they were conducted behind thick glass, communication reduced to distorted voices through telephones. Parents watched their sons grow thinner and quieter. Wives saw husbands withdraw emotionally, unsure how to bridge the gap created by years of separation. Advocacy groups began collecting testimonies from former SHU inmates. Their stories were strikingly similar, regardless of race or background. Men spoke of losing the ability to hold conversations. Some panicked in open spaces after release. Others could not sleep without lights on, conditioned by years of constant illumination. The SHU had not just punished them, it had reshaped them. One former inmate described his first night back in general population as terrifying. Surrounded by noise and movement, he felt overwhelmed, unable to process multiple voices at once. Another said he had forgotten how to shake hands, instinctively pulling away from physical contact. Years of enforced solitude had taught their bodies that proximity was danger. As these stories spread, public perception slowly shifted. What had once been framed as a necessary security measure began to look like an experiment in extreme isolation. Comparisons were drawn to historical practices long considered inhumane. International human rights experts criticized California's policies, arguing that indefinite solitary confinement violated basic standards of human dignity. Inside Pelican Bay, inmates followed these developments through fragments of news, legal documents, and whispered conversations through vents. Hope was dangerous, but impossible to suppress. When word of legal challenges reached the SHU, some prisoners began counting the years they had already lost, wondering if change would come too late for them. The hunger strikes transformed that quiet hope into collective action. Organized from inside solitary cells, the strikes demonstrated a level of coordination that contradicted the idea that isolation erased agency. Prisoners used legal mail, coded language, and mutual trust to organize across racial and gang lines, something the system claimed was impossible. During the strikes, the physical toll was severe. Inmates lost weight rapidly. Some collapsed in their cells. Medical staff intervened, sometimes forcibly. Yet many strikers remained resolute. They said the risk of death was preferable to another decade in isolation. Their statements shocked the public and forced officials to respond. Legislative hearings followed. Former SHU inmates testified about life inside Pelican Bay, describing years without touch, conversation, or sunlight. Lawmakers listened as men explained how isolation had damaged their ability to function long after release. The narrative shifted from punishment to consequence, from security to humanity. Still, for those inside the SHU, reform was slow. Each day remained the same. Concrete walls did not change overnight. But something had cracked. The certainty that Pelican Bay would remain untouched was gone. For the first time in decades, inmates allowed themselves to imagine an end, not to their sentences, but to the isolation itself. Some feared what would come next, unsure if they could survive outside the concrete box. Others welcomed the unknown, believing anything was better than endless silence. Pelican Bay had been built to control bodies, but it had revealed something officials did not anticipate. Even in extreme isolation, the human mind resists erasure. It bends, it fractures, but it does not disappear. And as the walls of the SHU began to face scrutiny from the outside world, a question lingered, one that would define the prison's future and the fate of the men inside it. If a system designed to break people ultimately breaks itself under scrutiny, what responsibility remains for the damage already done? That question would soon force California to confront Pelican Bay's darkest legacy. When the reforms finally came, they did not arrive with celebration. There were no announcements echoing through Pelican Bay's concrete corridors. No apologies from the system that had held men in silence for decades. Change came quietly, through paperwork, legal settlements, and policy revisions that felt almost unreal to the prisoners whose lives had been shaped by isolation. In 2015, California agreed to sharply limit the use of indefinite solitary confinement. The settlement ended the practice of holding inmates in the security housing unit solely based on gang validation. For the first time, prisoners who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years alone were told they would be released into general population units or transferred to less restrictive housing. The words sounded impossible. Some inmates reread the notices again and again, waiting for the catch. Leaving the SHU was not freedom. It was exposure. Men who stepped out of their cells after decades in isolation described the experience as physically disorienting. The noise of other people felt unbearable. Conversations overlapped. Doors slammed. Laughter echoed. Their bodies reacted with panic, racing hearts, shaking hands, nausea. Some asked to return to their cells, not because they preferred isolation, but because it was the only environment their minds still understood. Years in solitary confinement had rewritten their instincts. In the SHU, silence meant survival. Eye contact was meaningless. Physical distance was enforced. In general population, these rules no longer applied. A casual bump in a hallway could trigger fear or anger. Friendly gestures felt like threats. Many former SHU inmates stayed to themselves, sitting against walls, watching crowds from a distance, trying to relearn how to exist around other humans. The long-term effects became clearer as more men left isolation. Mental health professionals documented symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares were common. Some inmates could not sleep in darkness, haunted by memories of endless nights under fluorescent lights. Others struggled with decision-making, overwhelmed by choices as simple as when to shower or where to sit. For those eventually released from prison, the challenges multiplied. The outside world had changed while they remained frozen in time. Technology felt alien. Public spaces were overwhelming. Everyday interactions, ordering food, standing in line, making eye contact, became sources of anxiety. Some former prisoners avoided crowds entirely, isolating themselves again, this time without walls. Families tried to reconnect, but the damage of separation was deep. Children who had grown up without their fathers now faced strangers shaped by years of isolation. Parents welcomed sons who no longer knew how to express emotion. Relationships strained under the weight of silence that could not be easily undone. Despite these struggles, many former Pelican Bay inmates chose to speak out. They testified at hearings, participated in documentaries, and worked with advocacy groups to ensure their experiences were not erased. Their accounts were consistent and disturbing. Isolation had not made them safer or more rehabilitated. It had left them scarred. International attention followed. Human rights organizations cited Pelican Bay as an example of what happens when punishment loses its connection to humanity. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture stated that prolonged solitary confinement could amount to torture when used beyond 15 days. Pelican Bay had held men in isolation for decades. Within California's prison system, policies continued to evolve. Step-down programs were introduced, offering structured paths out of isolation. Oversight increased. Mentally ill inmates were, at least on paper, protected from placement in extreme solitary conditions. Pelican Bay's SHU, once its defining feature, became a shadow of what it had been. Yet for many, reform arrived too late. Some inmates died before seeing the end of isolation. Others were released carrying psychological wounds that no policy could heal. Laws changed, but memories remained locked inside concrete walls that still stand today. Pelican Bay itself became a symbol of fear-driven policy, of unchecked authority, of what happens when control is valued over consequence. It forced California to confront uncomfortable questions about punishment and human dignity. Was safety truly achieved by erasing human contact? Could society justify a system that left people broken long after their sentences ended? Former inmates often say the worst part was not the size of the cell or the lack of sunlight. It was the uncertainty, not knowing when or if the isolation would end. Hope became dangerous. Time became meaningless. Identity slowly dissolved. Some found ways to survive. They wrote poetry in their heads, memorized books, counted breaths. Others admitted they barely survived at all. They described moments when death felt like relief, not because they wanted to die, but because they wanted the suffering to stop. Today, Pelican Bay still houses some of California's most serious offenders, but its role has changed. The silence that once defined it has been interrupted by scrutiny, reform, and memory. The prison is no longer invisible. For the men who lived through its darkest years, Pelican Bay is not just a place. It is a chapter of their lives that never fully closes. The isolation may have ended, but its echoes remain, shaping who they are, how they think, and how they exist in the world. When inmates say Pelican Bay was worse than death, they are not speaking in metaphor. They are describing a kind of living that stripped away everything that made life recognizable: connection, time, hope. And in their words lies a warning, a reminder that punishment without limits does not end at prison walls. It follows people long after the doors open, long after the chains are removed, and long after the silence finally breaks.